Man was.
Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House, New Mexico, working on oil painting Memories Present. Alright, I've loosely and lightly roughed in the central figure for this painting. I'm going to kind of just do a fill of a mixture of phthalo blue, Prussian blue, and a little touch of cerulean. Just to lighten the mix up a touch. And he's going to be stark dark against this kind of writhing background here. So I'm going to do that first. There we go.
What sort of a piece of work this strange creature is? Before we come to the contemporary views on the problem, I think it's worthwhile to devote an hour to what our fathers thought about themselves and about human nature. After all, they were no stupider than we are. The difference between us and them is that we know more than they did. But perhaps by knowing more, in some respects, we don't know as much about certain things as they did. They chose to pay attention to certain things which we don't pay attention to. So that in some ways, it may be that they made up for their general scientific ignorance by certain insights which perhaps we have shut ourselves off from. Well, I shall begin by talking first about the view of man which we find in Homer, the father of Western poetry. We find Homer, of course, is not a philosopher and not a psychologist, but he was an extremely shrewd observer, and he evidently represented the general point of view of his times. And I shall begin by quoting a very interesting passage from the 19th book of the Iliad, which describes the reconciliation of Agamemnon and Achilles. Agamemnon, if you remember, enraged Achilles by taking away his captive, Briseis. And finally, when it became necessary for Achilles to come back into the battle, Agamemnon made a handsome apology in public to Achilles and explained why he had done what he had done. And he says there, I was not to blame. It was Zeus and my bad luck and the fury that walks in the darkness that blinded my judgment that day when I confiscated Achilles' girl. What could I do? At these moments, there is a power that takes command. Ate, the eldest daughter of Zeus, who blinds us, a cursed sprite that she is, flitting through men's heads, corrupting them, bringing down now one, now another. Why, even Zeus was blinded by her once, and he is known to stand above all men and all gods. Achilles accepts this explanation without any hesitation at all. Seems to him completely rational. And he says, how utterly a man can be blinded by Father Zeus. Now, who and what is Ate? In the Greek tragedies, the word stands for disaster. But in Homer, the word stands for the state of mind which brings on disaster, the state of blindness, the state of infatuation, the state of mind which leads us to do all kinds of absurd things against our own interest, things which make no sense to us whatever, and yet we still do them. And Homer personified this strange state of mind as an alien supernatural force which came into man. This, sometimes the gods themselves, in their more malicious moments, would come in and upset a man's judgment, but more often they sent this strange kind of fury, this daughter of Zeus, Ate, to carry out their vengeances upon human beings. And now Homer, of course, makes it quite clear that there are also positive interventions from the supernatural world. In general, these positive interventions are made through the medium of something that he calls menos. And menos is that kind of accession of power and eagerness and strength and vitality which permits us to do the impossible. Even animals are capable of experiencing menos. There are horses every now and then get a tremendous influx of menos and do the most extraordinary things in the Iliad. And in general, Homer would have said that any particularly good idea, anything above our ordinary level of intelligence, any remarkable action or great insight is given to us from the outside by a god who hands out his menos to us. And the god sometimes has a name. We know which god is at work within us. But occasionally, this is particularly true in the Odyssey, the god has no name. He is just called a daimon. He is some sort of a supernatural being. And in general, in Greek, until much later times, any supernatural being to whom one couldn't give a name, Zeus or Aphrodite or Athene, was just called a daimon. For example, the monitions which Socrates received were given him by a daimon, a nameless supernatural being. And it is interesting to note that Socrates, who is after all the father of Western rationalism, says in so many words, the greatest blessings come to us by way of madness, provided always that the madness is given to us as a divine gift, so that he himself recognized this supernatural influx which constantly influenced human beings. Now, Homer's daimons and gods are not mere fairy tale fantasies. They are principles of scientific explanation. He had to account for the very odd facts of human psychology, the fact that human beings are constantly doing things which are obviously against their interests, which they know to be stupid and bad. Similarly, they every now and then do things which seem to be far beyond their normal capacities of action or thought. And it seemed quite rational in the absence of any other hypothesis, I mean such a hypothesis as we have now of the dynamic unconscious. It was only rational to suppose that these strange events of which we are all conscious were due to the influx of supernatural powers. And it's interesting to realize that this idea of possession for good or for ill by supernatural powers went on being used as a principle of explanation right on almost to the end of the 17th century. But contemporary with Galileo and even with Newton, we find this Homeric idea of possession being used as currently as an explanation of many forms of many of the odder forms of human behavior. You will find, for example, in that compendium of 17th century psychology, the Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, an extremely good discussion of this whole problem. I mean, she points out that Most cases of strange behavior, of madness, madness and what we would call neurosis, most cases have a physical origin, but quite a good proportion of them are probably due to some kind of supernatural possession. And it's very interesting to notice that in the 18th century, when the idea of demonic possession had completely evaporated, nothing was brought in to take its place. We have a curious kind of interregnum, so to speak, in the history of psychology during the 18th and early 19th centuries, when the stranger aspects of human nature simply had no valid explanatory principles to account for them. For example, when the case of Mesmer was examined by the French Academy with the assistance of Benjamin Franklin, the only explanation that they could bring up for the strange phenomena which occurred in Mesmer's neighborhood was imagination. Well, imagination, such as we know it, quite clearly doesn't account for the kind of queer things which were happening in these early days of the hypnotic experimentation. And strangely enough, it is not until quite late in the 19th century that a satisfactory substitute for the old idea of possession comes into the world. It comes in, of course, with the development of the idea of a dynamic, unconscious self, what would be called the unconscious and the pre-conscious, or in general, the subliminal self. And the opening of the new period of psychology is dated by William James with the publication of a paper by F.W.H. Myers in, I think, 1882. So that it is extraordinarily recent that we have any satisfactory substitute for this ancient Homeric and afterwards Christian idea of demonic and divine possession as agents to account for the odder aspects of human behavior. Now, let us pass now for a moment to the practical side of Greek psychology. The Greeks were very realistic people, and they knew very well that the more distressing aspects, the more distressing consequences of possession could be warded off if some kind of satisfaction, either direct or indirect, were found for the instinctive drives and the frustrations and miseries of normal life. And the two great methods which they used, but to both of which they applied the term catharsis, the first of them, historically, was the method of the Dionysian orgy and dance. Dionysus, in this context, was called Lucios, the liberator, and he did liberate these people who lived an extraordinarily miserable life if they were slaves, from a great deal of their sense of frustration and unhappiness by, first of all, giving them alcohol, and in the second place, encouraging these congregational dances. At a later period, the Dionysian rites seemed to lose their interest, but their place was taken by the Corybantic dances in honor of the Great Mother. And here there was a specifically therapeutic value set upon these dances. For example, the people suffering from what we would now call anxiety syndromes or various types of neurosis were actually diagnosed by the way they responded to certain types of music And in this way, one could judge what daimon or god was possessing them, and suitable dances and religious rites were then prescribed for them, and they worked off in this way a great deal of the neurotic tension which was upsetting them. At this time, in the present day, of course, in many parts of the world, one can find exactly the same procedures being carried out. I was greatly struck, for example, 2 years ago when I was in Brazil, by what may be called the Latin American Menadism, or what is called in Rio Macumba, and what is called in
Alright,
Bahia.
so that sets them in. I sort of worked with the depth of the paint in order to define some of the features within the dark and left some little blips of light shining through to aid in the definition. But if it'll lighten up enough. There we go.
Of Rio or Bahia. On Saturday nights,
there we go.
Sense of frustration.
I don't think I can dial it out enough to.
By this night-long dancing, and it
Nope,
was
wrong
simply
way.
enough in all the dances that I witnessed.
There we go. That's as bright as that one goes.
The whole procedure was one of
Alright, that's as bright as I can get it.
muscular activity.
It's pretty dark blue. But as you can see, the texture sort of defines some of the details. But it's going to evolve from here. So that's about where I want it for now. So I can zoom in on my hands at least. There we go. Now you can see the light catching some of the texture of the paint and the way it sort of defines it dark within the dark. Same within the face.
In the Greek literature about the Menads, the tossing of the head, for example, which occurs again and again in descriptions of Menadism in Greece, was clearly exemplified in the Candomblé.
Alright, but that's it for the moment. That's Adam Sturch, broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting memories present. I'm going to go ahead and dial that back down to a reasonable level before I turn it down. Alright, thanks for watching. Have a good night, Earth.